Commander Sarah stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the massive fleet spread across the like a plague of metallic locusts. 300 warships against her single heavy cruiser. The odds should have been impossible, but Sarah had stopped believing in impossible odds long ago. "Commander, incoming transmission from the flagship," Lieutenant Torres announced from the communications station, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Put it through," Sarah replied, her hands clasped behind her back in the pose that had become her trademark during the 7 years she'd commanded this vessel. The bridge crew had learned to read her moods by the tension in her shoulders, and right now, they could sense something different about their captain. The holographic display shimmered to life, revealing the grotesque visage of Warlord, his mandibles clicking in what passed for amusement among his species. This exoskeleton gleamed with the ritual scarification that marked him as one of their most feared military leaders. Behind him, Sarah could see the dim red lighting of his command center and the hunched forms of his subordinates. "Human Commander," his voice came through the translation matrix with its characteristic buzzing undertone. "Your resistance ends here. Your pathetic species has proven more troublesome than anticipated, but this sector now belongs to the Empire. Surrender your vessel and submit to processing, and your crew will be granted the mercy of quick termination." Sarah's expression remained perfectly neutral, though several bridge officers shifted uncomfortably at the warlord's words. They all knew what processing meant in terms. The horror stories from occupied systems had reached Earth long before the invasion fleet arrived in their space. "Warlord," Sarah began, her voice carrying the calm authority that had seen her through a dozen impossible battles. "I appreciate your generous offer, but I'm afraid I must decline." This compound eyes focused more intently on her image. "You mock me, human. Your ship is outnumbered 300 to 1. Your escort vessels have been destroyed. Your reinforcements are scattered across 3 systems. What possible reason do you have to refuse the inevitable?" Sarah reached up and touched the simple black elastic band that held her dark hair in its regulation military bun. It was a gesture so small, so seemingly insignificant, that most of the bridge crew didn't even notice it at first. But Lieutenant Commander, her first officer, felt his breath catch. He'd served with Sarah for 5 years, and he knew what that particular movement meant. "Because, Warlord," Sarah said, her fingers slowly working the hair tie loose, "you made one critical error in your calculations." Her hair fell free, cascading in dark waves around her shoulders, and suddenly the sterile bridge of the Defiance felt charged with an electric tension that made every crew member's skin prickle. "And what error is that, human?" The mandibles spread wider, his species equivalent of a sneer. Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. "You assumed that because I'm outnumbered, I'm outmatched." The transmission cut as Sarah turned to face her crew. Every eye on the bridge was locked on their captain, and what they saw there made several of them unconsciously straighten their spines. This wasn't the same woman who had led them through the careful, calculated battles of the past months. This was something else entirely. Sarah called to her first officer, and her voice carried a note that made the man's pulse quicken with anticipation rather than fear. "Yes, Captain." "Signal the crew. Battle stations. Full combat protocols." And she turned to look at him directly, and he saw something in her eyes that reminded him why Sarah had earned her rank at an age when most officers were still learning how to properly fold their dress uniforms. "Yes, Captain." "Unlock the weapons." The bridge fell silent except for the hum of the ship's systems. Every crew member knew what that order meant. For 7 months, they'd fought with standard tactics, standard weapons, standard everything. They'd followed every regulation, every protocol, every rule of engagement that command had drilled into them during their years of service. But Sarah had earned her command stripes in the border wars, where regulations were suggestions and survival was the only rule that mattered. She'd learned her trade from captains who understood that sometimes. When you were backed into a corner with nowhere to run and nothing left to lose, you had to show the enemy exactly why humanity had clawed its way up from the primordial mud to reach for the stars. "Captain," Lieutenant Torres spoke up hesitantly, "regulations clearly state that enhanced weapons systems can only be activated with direct authorization from—" "Lieutenant," Sarah's voice cut across his words like a whip crack, "in approximately 10 minutes, the fleet is going to begin their attack run. They're expecting us to follow the rules. They're expecting us to fight fair. They're expecting us to be good little officers who color inside the lines and die politely when we're told to. She walked to the center of the bridge, her hair catching the light from the displays in a way that made her seem almost otherworldly. But here's the thing about humans, tours. When we're backed into a corner, when everything seems hopeless, when the odds are impossible. She paused, letting her words sink in. That's when we get creative. His hands moved across his console with practiced efficiency. Enhanced weapons systems coming online, Captain. All safety protocols disabled. We're reading full power to all batteries. Tactical, Sarah called out, settling into her command chair with a fluid grace that belied the tension of the moment. Show me everything. I want full sensor sweeps of that fleet. Power signatures, shield configurations, formation patterns, communication frequencies. Everything. Ensign Park's fingers danced across her console. Captain, I'm reading massive energy signatures from the flagship and 12 of their heavy cruisers. They're running their shields at maximum output, but their power distribution patterns suggest they're not expecting serious resistance. Good, Sarah murmured, studying the tactical display with the intensity of a chess master examining a particularly complex board. They're being cautious but confident. Classic doctrine, overwhelming force applied systematically. Captain said quietly, the crew is ready, but I have to ask. What exactly are we planning here? Even with enhanced weapons, we're still facing impossible odds. Sarah's smile returned, and this time there was something predatory about it. In all your years of studying military history, what's the one constant about every great victory against impossible odds? The first officer considered for a moment. The winning side did something unexpected. Exactly, they have studied our tactics. They know our capabilities. They've planned for everything we're supposed to be able to do. Sarah stood again, moving to where the enemy fleet was beginning to adjust its formation for the final approach. But they haven't planned for everything we can do. She turned back to her crew, and in that moment, every person on the bridge understood why Sarah had been chosen to command the Defiance despite her relative youth and unconventional methods. There was something in her bearing, something in the way she carried herself, that spoke of hidden depths and capabilities that went far beyond what appeared in any official record. You see, the thing about humans, Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the bridge, is that we've never been very good at accepting limitations. Someone tells us something is impossible, and we take it as a personal challenge. They think they know what we're capable of because they've only seen us fight by their rules. She moved to the tactical station, her fingers calling up displays that most of the crew had never seen before. But humans have been fighting wars for thousands of years before we ever met our first alien species. We've learned things about warfare that most civilized species would consider unsporting. Lieutenant Torres swallowed hard. Captain, what exactly are you planning to do? Sarah's answer sent a chill through every person on the bridge. I'm going to show Warlord why his species should have stayed on their own side of the galaxy. The fleet had begun its final approach, their massive vessels moving with the ponderous certainty of predators closing in for the kill. On their flagship, Warlord was no doubt savoring his anticipated victory, planning how he would report this success to his superiors. But on the bridge of the UES Defiance, Commander Sarah was preparing to demonstrate a fundamental truth about humanity that they were about to learn the hard way. When humans were pushed to the edge, when all hope seemed lost, when surrender was the only logical option. That was when they became truly dangerous. The Defiance trembled as Sarah's fingers moved across the enhanced weapons control interface, accessing systems that had been sealed since the ship's construction. These weren't the clean, regulated energy weapons that preferred to use in their diplomatic conflicts. These were the tools that humanity had developed during the darker chapters of their expansion into space, weapons designed not for honorable combat, but for survival against overwhelming odds. Captain, Ensign Park called from her station, voice tight with nervous energy. The fleet has entered maximum weapons range. They're maintaining formation, but I'm detecting charge buildup in their primary batteries. Let them charge, Sarah replied without looking away from her console. Remember the Ganymede incident. Her first officer's face went pale. The Ganymede incident was classified at levels so high that most officers didn't even know it had happened. Captain, you can't be serious. The casualties were. The casualties were acceptable because the alternative was extinction, Sarah cut him off. They want to process our entire species. They want to turn every human being in the galaxy into raw materials for their war machine. Sometimes, when the stakes are that high, you have to make choices that keep you awake at night. She turned to face the bridge crew, and her expression was no longer that of an officer following protocols. This was the face of a predator who had been hiding among prey for far too long. What I'm about to show you doesn't leave this bridge. Understood. The crew nodded in unison, sensing that they were about to witness something that would fundamentally change their understanding of both their captain and their species. Sarah's hands moved across her console with practiced precision, and suddenly the Defiance's sensor readings shifted dramatically. Where moments before they had detected one human vessel, the sensors now showed 3 distinct signatures. Impossible, Lieutenant Torres breathed, staring at his displays. Captain, how are we showing multiple ship signatures? Holographic projection combined with sensor spoofing, Sarah explained, her voice taking on the tone of a professor lecturing particularly slow students. The technology has existed for decades, but it's considered too unpredictable for standard military use. Too much chance of friendly fire incidents. Ensign Park's voice cracked slightly as she spoke. Captain, the fleet is... They're confused. I'm reading massive communication chatter across their entire formation. They're trying to determine which signals are real. On the main, the massive fleet's perfect formation began to waver as individual ships adjusted their targeting solutions, unable to determine which of the 3 apparent human vessels posed the greatest threat. But Sarah wasn't finished. Her next command made question everything he thought he knew about their ship's capabilities. Engineering, initiate Protocol 7. The bridge lights dimmed as power was redirected throughout the ship. Deep in the Defiance's hull, systems that had been dormant since construction began to hum with deadly purpose. The ship's hull temperature dropped rapidly as heat sinks engaged, making them nearly invisible to thermal sensors. Their electromagnetic signature dispersed across multiple frequencies, creating the impression of a ship much smaller and less threatening than they actually were. Captain said slowly, "These aren't protocols, this technology. Where did it come from?" Sarah's smile was cold as deep space. During the border wars, we encountered species that made them look like gentle philosophers. We learned that sometimes, survival requires tools that polite society prefers to forget exist. The fleet had closed to optimal firing range, but their confusion was evident in their hesitation. Warlord's voice crackled across the communication channel, his translator struggling with what seemed to be a stream of invective in the language. "Human Commander, what trickery is this? Show yourself." Sarah activated the transmission with a gesture that looked almost casual. "Warlord, I'm right here, all 3 of me." "These illusions will not save you. We will simply destroy all 3 signatures." "You could do that," Sarah agreed pleasantly. "Of course, you'd be firing into a formation that includes 2 of your own heavy cruisers. I'm afraid your sensor operators haven't noticed that yet." The silence that followed this statement was deafening. On the tactical display, it became clear that the Defiance's holographic projections had been carefully positioned to overlap with vessel signatures. Any attempt to destroy the human ship would result in significant friendly fire casualties. But Sarah's psychological warfare was only the opening move. Lieutenant Commander watched with growing amazement as his captain began to demonstrate capabilities that transformed the Defiance from a single desperate vessel into something that every assumption they had made about human technology. "Tors, begin narrowband transmission to the fleet. Not to their command frequencies, target their individual ship computers directly." "Captain, that's not possible with our communication array. We don't have the processing power to..." "We do now," Sarah interrupted. "The enhanced systems include quantum processors that have been running parallel calculations since we first detected the fleet. We've had 2 hours to analyze their communication protocols and encryption methods." Tor's eyes widened as his console displayed capabilities he had never seen before. "Captain, these systems? They're military grade, but not any military I recognize. This technology is decades ahead of standard equipment." "Gets the tools they need for diplomatic missions and police actions," Sarah said simply. "This ship was designed for a different kind of work." The first signs of success came as several vessels began reporting system malfunctions. Their targeting computers started providing conflicting information. Their navigation systems began registering false readings. Their internal communication networks experienced cascading failures that left individual ships isolated from fleet coordination. "My God," whispered, "you're not just jamming their communications, you're rewriting their software." "Cybernetic warfare," Sarah confirmed. "Another tool that polite society prefers not to discuss. They use biological neural networks for their computers, very efficient, very secure against conventional electronic warfare, but biological systems have biological vulnerabilities." Ensign Park's voice rose with excitement. "Captain, I'm reading massive system failures across the fleet. At least 40 vessels have lost primary navigation. Their formation is beginning to collapse." But even as the enemy fleet struggled with cascading technical failures, Sarah wasn't finished demonstrating the hidden capabilities of her vessel. Her next command revealed the true nature of the weapons systems that had been locked away since the Defiance's construction. "Tactical, prepare the Hellfire batteries." The silence on the bridge was absolute. Every crew member knew that name from their military history courses, but they also knew that such weapons had been banned by every civilized species in the galaxy. Captain's voice was barely a whisper. "Hellfire weapons were outlawed by the Geneva Accords. They're considered crimes against sentience." Sarah's expression hardened. The Geneva Accords were written by species who had never faced extinction. The Hellfire batteries aren't designed to destroy ships. They're designed to destroy the will to fight. She activated another console, and the bridge displays showed weapon systems that belonged in nightmares rather than military arsenals. The Hellfire batteries used focused energy beams to create localized gravitational distortions, literally tearing matter apart at the subatomic level. The visual effect was exactly what the name implied: streams of energy that looked like liquid fire reaching across space to unmake anything they touched. "They believe in the superiority of overwhelming force," Sarah continued, her voice taking on an almost philosophical tone. "They've built their entire military doctrine around the assumption that they can always bring more ships, more weapons, more soldiers than their enemies. But humans learned long ago that there are some weapons so terrible that numbers become irrelevant." Warlord's voice burst through the communication system, his translator struggling to convey what sounded like panic. "Human, what manner of weapons are these? Our sensors detect energy signatures that should be impossible." "Oh, they're not impossible, Warlord," Sarah replied conversationally. "Just highly inadvisable, but you see, you put me in a position where advisable ceased to be an option." The first Hellfire beam lanced out from the Defiance, a stream of controlled destruction that intersected with a heavy cruiser. The enemy vessel didn't explode. It simply ceased to exist, its matter converted to energy in a cascade reaction that left nothing but empty space and radiation. The psychological impact on the fleet was immediate and devastating. These were warriors who had conquered dozens of species, but they had never encountered weapons that could simply erase their ships from existence without even leaving debris behind. "Impossible," breathed, staring at the tactical display. "Captain, the power requirements alone should have overloaded our entire grid." "Enhanced fusion cores," Sarah explained, her attention focused on the targeting solutions for her next shot. "The Defiance isn't just a heavy cruiser. She's a prototype weapons platform designed to test technologies that would make other species ask uncomfortable questions about human intentions." As the reality of their situation began to penetrate the fleet's command structure, Sarah prepared to deliver the final demonstration of why humanity had managed to survive in a galaxy filled with species that possessed superior numbers, technology, and resources. The truth was simple. When humans were pushed to the edge of the fleet's retreat began not with orders from their command structure, but with individual ship captains making the desperate calculation that survival was more important than military discipline. As the third vessel was reduced to its component atoms by the Hellfire batteries, panic spread through their formation like wildfire. "Captain," Ensign Park reported, her voice filled with amazement, "I'm reading massive power fluctuations across the enemy fleet. At least 60 vessels are attempting to break formation and withdraw." But Sarah wasn't finished teaching her lesson. The hair that now flowed freely around her shoulders seemed to catch every light on the bridge, creating an almost hypnotic effect as she moved between stations with the fluid grace of a predator who had finally revealed her true nature. "Tours open a general broadcast to the fleet. All frequencies, maximum power. I want every ship to receive this message. Channel open, Captain. Sarah's voice, when she spoke, carried across space with the weight of absolute authority. Warlord and all vessels of the invasion fleet. You came to our space believing that humans were weak, that our technology was inferior, that our will to fight could be broken by superior numbers. You were wrong on all counts. The tactical display showed the enemy formation continuing to deteriorate as more ships attempted to flee, their captains apparently deciding that whatever disgrace awaited them at home was preferable to facing the impossible human vessel that had just demonstrated the ability to erase matter from existence. Let me share some information about humanity that your intelligence services apparently failed to discover, Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly over the communication channels. We are not a peaceful species that was forced into warfare by circumstances. We are a species that evolved from predators, that spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing our own kind before we ever reached for the stars. Watched his captain with growing fascination. This wasn't the Sarah who had led them through months of careful, calculated engagements. This was someone else entirely, someone who had been hiding beneath the surface of an officer for years. The weapons you've seen today represent perhaps 1% of humanity's true military capability, Sarah's voice continued. We've spent centuries developing tools of war so effective that we banned ourselves from using them, not because they don't work, but because they work too well. On the main, the image of Warlord flickered as his flagship's communication systems struggled with cascading failures. His mandibles were spread wide in what Sarah recognized as an expression of extreme distress among his species. Human Commander, his voice crackled through the failing transmission, your species cannot possess such capabilities. Our intelligence indicated that human technology was decades behind our own. Sarah's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Your intelligence was designed to see exactly what we wanted you to see, Warlord. Did you really think that a species capable of building interstellar civilizations would be naive enough to reveal their true capabilities to potential enemies? She moved to the tactical station, her fingers dancing across controls that access systems was certain hadn't existed moments before. Let me show you what human ingenuity can accomplish when we stop playing by civilized rules. The next weapon Sarah activated made the Hellfire batteries seem conventional by comparison. Instead of targeting enemy ships directly, it began to affect the space around them. The vacuum itself became weaponized as exotic particles created localized distortions in the fabric of reality. Spatial compression torpedoes, Sarah announced to her bridge crew, though her words were clearly intended for the fleet as well. They don't destroy enemy vessels so much as relocate them to dimensions where the laws of physics are different. The effect was immediate and terrifying. 3 destroyers simply vanished from normal space, their sensor signatures disappearing as if they had never existed. No explosion, no debris, no radiation signature. They were simply gone. Where did they go? Lieutenant Torres asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Parallel space, Sarah replied casually, as if she were discussing the weather. They still exist, technically. They're just existing in a universe where the speed of light is significantly lower and gravity behaves in interesting ways. Very educational, I'm sure. The psychological impact on the fleet was beyond devastating. These were warriors who understood death in battle, who could face destruction with honor. But weapons that simply erased their comrades from existence, that banished them to alternate dimensions, that treated the fundamental laws of reality as suggestions to be ignored, these were beyond their comprehension. Impossible. Warlord's voice was filled with something that might have been terror if translated correctly. No species possesses such technology. The energy requirements alone would require mastery of zero-point energy extraction, Sarah interrupted smoothly, which humans achieved approximately 50 years ago. We just decided it would be impolite to mention it in our diplomatic exchanges. Found himself staring at his captain with new eyes. Sarah, who are you really? These capabilities, this technology, this isn't standard equipment. This isn't even experimental military hardware. This is something else entirely. Sarah turned to face him, and for a moment her expression softened slightly. I'm exactly who I've always been. The difference is that until today, I never had reason to show you what humanity is truly capable of when pushed to the edge of extinction. She moved to the center of the bridge, her hair catching the light from the displays in a way that made her seem almost otherworldly. Every species in this galaxy makes the same mistake when they encounter humans. They see our diplomatic corps, our exploration vessels, our peaceful colonies, and they assume that represents the full extent of our capabilities. They forget that we're the species that fought its way up from the bottom of a planetary food chain to become masters of interstellar travel in less than 1,000 years. The tactical display showed that the fleet's formation had completely collapsed. Ships were fleeing in all directions, their captains apparently willing to risk court-martial rather than face whatever horror the human vessel might demonstrate next. But perhaps, Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly across the communication channels, you'd like to see what happens when humans stop pretending to be civilized. Her next command activated weapons systems that existed in the gray area between military technology and crimes against reality itself. The Defiance's hull began to reconfigure itself, panels sliding away to reveal weapon batteries that belonged in the realm of theoretical physics rather than practical engineering. Quantum Cascade Disruptors, Sarah announced, and even her own crew flinched at the name. These don't destroy matter or energy. They destroy the quantum states that allow matter and energy to exist in coherent forms. The first disruptor beam reached across space to touch a battle cruiser. The effect was unlike anything the galaxy had seen in warfare. The enemy vessel didn't explode or disintegrate. It simply began to exist in multiple quantum states simultaneously. One moment it was a functional warship. The next it existed as a probability cloud spread across several light-minutes of space. By the sacred nests, Warlord's voice was barely recognizable through his failing translation matrix. What manner of demons are you? We're not demons, Warlord, Sarah replied, and her voice carried a note of something that might have been pity. We're humans. We're what happens when a species spends millions of years learning to survive against impossible odds, then discovers that the universe contains other species who mistake our caution for weakness. The retreat of the fleet had become a rout. Ships were jumping to hyperspace without waiting for navigation calculations, desperate to escape before the human vessel could demonstrate even more impossible capabilities. But Sarah wasn't finished with her demonstration. "Attention all vessels," she broadcast, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just redefined the balance of power in the galaxy. "You will retreat to your own space immediately. You will not return to human territory. You will inform your high command that Earth is no longer a target for conquest." She paused, letting her words sink in across the chaotic communication channels of the fleeing fleet. "And if your species is ever tempted to test human resolve again, remember this day. Remember that we showed you mercy by allowing you to retreat. Next time, we might decide to show you what human warfare looks like when we're not interested in taking prisoners." As the last of the ships disappeared into hyperspace, Sarah stood on the bridge of the Defiance and surveyed what she had accomplished. In less than an hour, she had transformed a hopeless last stand into a decisive victory that would reshape the balance of power across the galaxy. But the victory came with a price. Her crew was looking at her with a mixture of the bridge of the UES Defiance fell into an almost cathedral-like silence as the last sensor traces of the fleet disappeared into the depths of hyperspace. The exotic weapon systems that had just redefined galactic warfare began their shutdown sequences, their impossible energies cycling down with barely audible harmonic vibrations that seemed to resonate in the bones of every crew member present. Sarah stood motionless at the center of the bridge, her dark hair still flowing free around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the that now showed nothing but stars and the distant debris of the escort vessels that had died defending this sector. In the space of a single hour, she had transformed from a competent commander into something that easy categorization. Lieutenant Commander was the first to break the silence, his voice carefully controlled but unable to hide the undercurrent of shock that ran through his words. "Captain, I need to ask you a question, and I need an honest answer." Sarah turned to face him, and her expression was unreadable. "Go ahead." "Are you actually human?" The question hung in the air like a live wire, and Sarah could feel every eye on the bridge focusing on her with an intensity that bordered on desperate. They had just witnessed capabilities that challenged everything they thought they knew about technology, physics, and the species they served. Sarah's laugh was soft but genuine. "I'm as human as any of you. I was born in New Shanghai, educated at the Lunar Academy, served my time on patrol vessels in the Outer Rim. What you saw today wasn't alien technology or supernatural powers. It was human innovation pushed to its logical conclusion. She moved to the science station, calling up displays that showed the technical specifications of the weapons they had just employed. Every system you witnessed today was developed by human scientists and engineers. Every strategy I used was based on human military doctrine. Every principle I applied came from a human warfare experience. Ensign Park raised her hand hesitantly, as if she were a student in a classroom rather than an officer on a starship bridge. Captain, if humans possess these capabilities, why aren't they standard throughout the fleet? Why do we fight with conventional weapons when we could do what we just did? Sarah's expression grew somber. Because, Ensign, there's a difference between being capable of something and being wise enough to use it. The weapons you saw today represent the culmination of human military research, but they also represent choices that most of our leadership hoped we'd never have to make. She activated another display, this one showing casualty projections for various conflict scenarios. A single Hellfire battery could sterilize a planet's surface in minutes. Spatial compression torpedoes could relocate entire star systems to pocket dimensions. Quantum cascade disruptors could unravel the fundamental forces that hold matter together on a galactic scale. The implications of her words settled over the bridge like a heavy blanket. Lieutenant Torres spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. Captain, if we've possessed these capabilities all along, why did we let them push us to the edge of extinction? Why did we allow them to conquer human colonies? Sarah's smile was sad and infinitely weary. Because once you use weapons like these, Tors, you change the nature of warfare forever. Not just for yourself, but for every species in the galaxy. We hoped that conventional resistance would be enough to convince that conquest was too costly to pursue. She walked to the communications station, her fingers moving across controls that accessed archived files buried so deeply in the ship's computer core that most of the crew hadn't even known they existed. But there's another reason we've kept these capabilities hidden. Would you like to see what happened the last time humans decided to reveal their true military potential? The main shifted to display historical footage that bore classification levels so high that several bridge officers instinctively looked away, unsure whether they were authorized to view what they were seeing. The images showed a star system that had once been home to a species called the aggressive conquerors who had made the mistake of targeting human colonies during the early expansion period. The footage showed human fleets engaging forces with weapons that turned the very fabric of space into a battlefield. The possessed technology superior to anything they have shown us, Sarah narrated as the historical record played out. They had conquered half a dozen species before they encountered humanity. They saw us as primitive upstarts who had barely mastered interstellar travel. They showed the systematic destruction of the fleet, but it wasn't the clean, surgical engagement that the crew had just participated in. This was something else entirely, warfare conducted with such overwhelming superiority that it bordered on the supernatural. The engagement lasted 14 minutes, Sarah continued. When it was over, the Empire had ceased to exist. Not just their fleet, not just their military installations. Their entire civilization was gone. 12 billion sentient beings, removed from existence so efficiently that their home system was left completely sterile. His face had gone pale. My God, Sarah, what did we do to them? We used weapons that attacked the quantum foundations of their biology, Sarah replied simply. Every in the galaxy simply stopped being, simultaneously. Their DNA unraveled at the subatomic level. Their consciousness dispersed into quantum foam. They didn't die. Death implies that they had once been alive. It was as if they had never existed at all. The historical footage ended, leaving the bridge in silence so complete that the hum of the life support system seemed deafening by comparison. After the incident, Sarah continued, humanity made a collective decision. We would hide our true capabilities. We would fight with conventional weapons, accept casualties that we could easily prevent, allow our enemies to believe they had a chance of victory. Because the alternative was to become the monsters that every other species in the galaxy would unite to destroy. Ensign Park's voice was barely audible. But Captain, if that's true, then today we've revealed that the monsters were always there, Sarah finished. We just chose not to let them out to play. But when faced with extinction, when pushed to the absolute edge of survival, humans make different choices. She turned to address her entire crew, and her voice carried the weight of someone who understood the historical significance of what they had just accomplished. Every person on this bridge is now party to information that could reshape galactic civilization. The knowledge that humanity possesses weapons that make us functionally invincible is going to change how every species in the galaxy views us. Found his voice again, though it sounded strained. What happens now, Captain? They will report what they saw here. Other species will learn about our capabilities. How does this end? Sarah's expression was unreadable as she considered the question. There are several possibilities. Option 1, other species decide that humanity is too dangerous to exist and unite against us. Option 2, they decide that humanity is too dangerous to antagonize and leave us alone. Option 3, they try to steal or duplicate our technology. She moved to her command chair, settling into it with the fluid grace that her crew had learned to associate with their captain's most dangerous moods. But there's a fourth option that I suspect will actually occur. What's that, Captain? Torres asked. Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. They'll realize that if humans have been hiding capabilities like this for generations, what else might we be hiding? They'll start to wonder whether the peaceful, diplomatic humanity they thought they knew was ever real at all. And that uncertainty, that knowledge that they're dealing with a species that considers weapons of mass quantum destruction to be acceptable tools of warfare. She paused, letting her words sink in. That's going to make them very, very careful about how they interact with us in the future. The still showed the empty space where the fleet had been, but now it seemed to represent something more than a tactical victory. It represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power that would reshape every diplomatic, military, and economic relationship in the galaxy. Captain said slowly, there's one more question I have to ask. If humans possess these capabilities, if we've always been capable of this level of warfare, why do we need a military at all? Why not just tell every potential enemy what we're capable of and let deterrence handle the rest? Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. Because there's a difference between being able to do something and being willing to do it. Today, I crossed lines that most humans hope they never have to cross. I used weapons that violate everything our species claims to stand for. I became the monster that every other species is going to see when they look at humanity from now on. 3 months after the engagement that would come to be known as the Defiance Incident, Commander Sarah stood in the pristine conference room aboard the UES Enterprise, facing a tribunal of the highest-ranking officers in command. Her dark hair was once again pulled back in regulation style, held by the same simple black elastic band that had started everything. But the woman who sat at the defendant's table bore little resemblance to the officer, who had routinely followed protocols and regulations for the past 7 years. Admiral, the Chief of Operations, leaned forward across the polished table, his weathered face showing the strain of dealing with the galactic crisis that Sarah's actions had precipitated. Commander, in the 3 months since your engagement with the fleet, we have received communication from 47 different species, ranging from formal protests to what can only be described as diplomatic ultimatums. The galactic community is in chaos. Sarah's expression remained perfectly neutral. Yes, sir, I'm aware of the diplomatic situation. Are you, Admiral, the head of intelligence, activated a holographic display that showed star charts marked with indicators that painted a disturbing picture of the current state of galactic relations. The Confederation has recalled all their ambassadors from human space. The Vulcan Science Directorate has suspended all joint research projects. The Republic has imposed trade sanctions that are affecting 17 human colonies. The third member of the tribunal, Admiral T. Zarin of Vulcan, spoke with the measured tone that her species was known for, though even she couldn't hide the underlying tension in her voice. Commander, your actions have fundamentally altered the perception of humanity throughout the galaxy. Species that once considered us allies now view us as an existential threat. Sarah remained silent, her hands folded calmly in her lap, as the admirals continued their recitation of the crisis her actions had created. But when they finished, her response cut straight to the heart of the matter. Respectfully, admirals, what would you have had me do? Allow the fleet to process my crew and continue their conquest of human space. Admiral's jaw tightened. You could have followed established protocols. You could have attempted a fighting withdrawal. You could have. I could have died honorably while accomplishing nothing, Sarah interrupted, and for the first time in the hearing, her voice carried an edge that reminded everyone present of exactly what she was capable of. With respect, sir, protocols are written by people who have the luxury of not facing extinction. Admiral T. Zarin activated another display, this one showing technical analyses of the weapons systems Sarah had employed. Commander, our science teams have been attempting to understand the technology you revealed. The energy signatures alone suggest capabilities that violate several fundamental principles of physics as we understand them. The technology exists, Sarah replied simply. It has existed for decades. The only thing that changed was my willingness to use it. And that, Admiral leaned forward, is exactly the problem. These capabilities you demonstrated, where did they come from? Our records show no development programs for weapons of this magnitude. No research proposals, no testing data, no authorization for deployment. Sarah's smile was barely visible, but it carried implications that sent a chill through the room. Admiral, with all due respect, perhaps your clearance level isn't sufficient to access those records. The silence that followed this statement was absolute. The three admirals exchanged glances that spoke volumes about internal power structures and classification levels that even they weren't fully aware of. Admiral recovered first, his voice carefully controlled. Commander, are you saying that there are military programs operating above the oversight of command? I'm saying, sir, that humanity has always understood the difference between the military capabilities we choose to display and the capabilities we actually possess. The Defiance wasn't just a heavy cruiser. It was a test platform for technologies that we hoped we'd never need to use. She stood and walked to looking out at the stars beyond Earth's orbital facilities. Every species in this galaxy makes the same mistake when they study humanity. They look at our exploration vessels, our diplomatic corps, our peaceful colonies, and they assume that represents the full extent of who we are. They forget that we're the species that survived ice ages, plagues, global wars, and countless other extinction-level events before we ever reached for the stars. Admiral T. Zarin's voice carried a note of what might have been curiosity. Commander, if humanity possesses such capabilities, why has this information been concealed from senior leadership? Sarah turned back to face the tribunal, and her expression was that of someone who had spent months considering this very question. Because, Admiral, there's a difference between being capable of something and being wise enough to use it sparingly. The weapons I employed against the fleet represent choices that most of humanity hoped we'd never have to make. She returned to her seat, but her posture remained that of someone who was participating in the hearing by choice rather than compulsion. But when faced with extinction, when our entire species was threatened with processing into raw materials for an alien war machine, those philosophical concerns became luxuries we couldn't afford. Admiral activated a communication device on the table. Commander, I want you to hear something. This is a recording of a transmission we received from the High Command 2 days ago. The voice that emerged from the speakers was heavily distorted by translation matrices, but the underlying tone of terror was unmistakable. To the human government, the Empire hereby acknowledges that human space is to be considered permanently off-limits to all military operations. We further acknowledge that any hostile action against human interests will result in consequences that our species cannot survive. We do not seek war with demons who can unmake reality itself. The recording ended, and Admiral fixed Sarah with a stare that could have melted armor plating. Demons, Commander, that's how they describe us now. An entire species that once considered humanity to be inferior has redefined us as something beyond their understanding. And yet, Sarah pointed out, they're no longer planning to process our colonies into raw materials. I'd call that a successful diplomatic outcome. Admiral activated another display, this one showing communication intercepts from dozens of species across the galaxy. Commander, the diplomatic ramifications extend far beyond the Empire. Intelligence agencies across the galaxy are now attempting to discover what other capabilities humanity might be hiding. Trade negotiations have stalled because our partners no longer trust that they're dealing with the same species they thought they knew. Perhaps, Sarah suggested, they never really knew us at all. Perhaps they only knew the version of humanity that we chose to show them. The implications of her statement seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence. Admiral T. Zarin's next question cut straight to the heart of the matter. Commander, in your professional opinion, How many other human vessels possess the capabilities you demonstrated aboard the Defiance? Sarah's pause before answering was long enough to be meaningful. That would depend on what you consider to be capabilities worth discussing, Admiral. Answer the question, Commander. Sarah's smile returned, and this time it carried implications that made all three admirals shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Every human vessel that's been commissioned in the past 20 years carries enhanced systems. The difference is that most captains never receive authorization to access them. Authorization from whom? Admiral demanded. From departments that you don't have clearance to know about, sir. The tribunal fell silent as the true implications of Sarah's statements began to sink in. The woman sitting before them wasn't just a commander who had exceeded her authority in a moment of crisis. She was a representative of a shadow military structure that operated beyond the oversight of conventional command hierarchies. Admiral's voice was carefully controlled when he spoke again. Commander, are you saying that command has been operating under incomplete information about our own military capabilities? I'm saying, Admiral, that the organization you command is the public face of human military power. It's designed to interact with other species, to explore, to maintain peace through diplomacy and limited force projection. But underneath that public facade, humanity has always maintained capabilities that we hoped we'd never need to reveal. She stood again, and this time her movement carried the fluid grace of someone who was no longer pretending to be bound by conventional military discipline. The question before this tribunal isn't whether my actions were justified. The threat has been neutralized, human space is secure, and our colonies are no longer facing extinction. The question is what happens next. Admiral's voice carried a note of something that might have been fear. What do you mean, Commander? Sarah's final words would be quoted in classified documents and whispered conversations for years to come. I mean, Admirals, that the galaxy now knows what humanity is truly capable of when pushed to the edge of extinction. Every species out there is now asking themselves the same question. If humans were hiding weapons that can unmake reality itself, what else might they be hiding? She moved toward the door of the conference room, then paused to deliver her final observation. And the answer to that question is that they're about to find out. As Commander Sarah left the tribunal behind, the simple black hair tie in her hand seemed to represent far more than a minor violation of dress code regulations. It represented the moment when humanity stopped pretending to be something they weren't, and started being exactly what the galaxy needed them to be. The species that other species were very, very careful not to anger. The age of human diplomatic restraint was over. The age of human honesty about their true capabilities had just begun. And across the galaxy, every species was beginning to realize that they had been sharing space with apex predators who had simply chosen to pretend to be prey. Until someone made the mistake of threatening their survival. The hair tie remained loose, and Sarah had no intention of ever binding it again. She stood again, moving to the and staring out at the stars with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of the entire galaxy. The question now isn't whether we can defend ourselves. The question is whether we can remain human while doing it. And uncertainty, as if they were seeing their captain clearly for the first time. The comfortable illusions about human nature and peaceful mission had been shattered, replaced by the uncomfortable truth about what their species was truly capable of when survival was at stake. Extinction, they didn't just fight back. They fought back with weapons and tactics so ruthless, so utterly without mercy, that their enemies began to question whether victory was worth the price of teaching humanity exactly how dangerous they could become. The hair tie lay forgotten on the floor beside her chair, and Sarah began to plan the impossible.